Sarah. It's great to be here and to see so many familiar faces, but some of you don't know me. So my name is Kathy Holtman, and I'm at the University of New Brunswick. I'm an associate professor in the sociology department there, and I also direct the Muriel McQueen Ferguson Center for Family Violence Research. I'm very excited to be facilitating this session today. And we have, I think, three excellent graduate students and some very interesting papers. So first, I'd like to start by introducing Alicia Cummins. She's a doctoral candidate at the University of Ottawa and an instructor of religion in the College of Humanities at Carleton University. Alicia's teaching and research interests include contemporary Islam, religion and migration, religion and identity, religion and society, religion and politics, religious literacy, and religion and social change. Alicia also works as a research assistant for two projects. One is the Transmission of Religion Across Generations project, and the other is Non-Religion in a Complex Future. And both of these projects are out of the University of Ottawa. So Alicia's going to present today, Alleviating the Clash of Ignorance, Combating Islamophobia through Religious Literacy. Over to you, Alicia.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Here we go. And presentation mode. There we go. So my research, or this presentation, stems from my doctoral dissertation, which looks at how the Ismaili Muslim community in Canada is trying to combat Islamophobia. It looks at different ways that they're doing it, and one way is through religious literacy. So what I'm going to cover in this presentation specifically is that first I'm going to answer what is Islamophobia, what are its consequences, and then I'm going to talk about what is religious literacy and why is that important in combating Islamophobia. And then I'm going to look at some of the things I found in my research, particularly pertaining to exactly how the Ismaili community is trying to alleviate Islamophobia through various religious literacy efforts. So what is Islamophobia? Well, just generally speaking, it's the fear, hatred, or extreme dislike of Muslims or Islam. It is often fueled by mass generalizations, misrepresentations, and misunderstandings about Muslims. And, you know, we can't neglect the role that media plays in promoting these harmful narratives and normalizing, these homogenous understanding, these constructions of Muslims. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about Islamophobia and its consequences. Some of the most obvious ones, there's many, and I'm only touching on a few of them here, but obviously hate crimes is really important. We can see the rise of hate crimes against Muslims and Muslim-looking individuals in Canada specifically. You'll notice that there's been an increase here in 2015 and 2016, and you can see that media at that time was largely propagating this, using anti-Muslim narratives and fostering anti-Muslim sentiment to basically gain votes. So the Conservative Party of Canada was doing that, and then we also have on the other side of the other side of North America, basically through Donald Trump, kind of pushing this anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant narratives. Okay, so hate crimes again have directly affected Muslims, and these are only those that have been reported. There's also hate incidences, which the National Council for Canadian Muslims documents on their own website, but I won't talk too much about that there. But so anytime that there's a hate incident, they record that on their map to show over the years how they have had a steady increase, and also the types of incidences that have been reported. Now, probably the most horrific consequence of Islamophobia has been the Quebec mosque massacre, which killed 6 Muslims in Quebec in 2017. So again, we can see how this anti-Muslim sentiment is having real lived consequences in the lives of Muslims. And this isn't an isolated incident. We see, mosque attacks, vandalism, and killing of Muslims around the world today. Another important aspect is how Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment normalizes the discriminatory laws. Now, we see this in the European example. You know, we've been seeing it for the past decade with veiling bans and the like. But this is the first. This is the first that we see it in Canada and in Quebec specifically with Bill 21, which prohibits religious symbols in public service. But not only that, we need to understand that when this directly targets Muslim women, it excludes them from participating in Canadian society. And what we don't know, and what Homa Hoodfar actually talks about in her research on veiling and not veiling Muslims in Iran, is that forced veiling laws or forced non-veiling laws directly affect Muslim women because it makes them more dependent on their male relatives and caregivers, right? So it actually has economical consequences for Muslim women. You're basically asking a Muslim woman to choose between her faith and her livelihood, and that's a difficult decision for anyone. So what is religious literacy? So religious literacy is having this basic understanding of any religious tradition, but in the context of its cultural milieu. So what's happening, like not just, you know, it's looking at the context, the cultural context in which religion is shaped and continues to be shaped. So it looks at how religion is dynamic and how it responds to various cultural aspects. Now, religious literacy is important because it can help alleviate this fear and distress of the other, right? So, as I presented in the Canadian example, othering has led to various discriminatory practices that affect the lives of Muslims. There we go. So what is religious literacy? I've taken this from Ali Asani. Religious illiteracy is the inability to conceive religion as a cultural phenomenon, right? It's embedded in what he calls complex cultural matrices. So that looks at social status, poverty, gender, political ideologies, and how all these things, right, shape religious identity. So religious literacy is basically not just asking somebody to look at how culture and context shape religion, but also looking at how all these factors will lead to diverse internal diversity within a religious tradition, right? So with Muslims, you know, just as with Christians, there are, you know, there are Shia Muslims, there are Sunni Muslims, there are Sufi Muslims, there are Ahmadi Muslims, and there are other non-identifying other Muslims that just identify as Muslim. And then you have to understand that even within those traditions, there is a diversity of other theological understandings, a diversity of practice, and you know, culture, language. All these things shape Muslim diversity. So what I found in my research is, with the example of the Ismaili community, they're not replacing one homogenous narrative of Islam with another, saying that's not Islam, this is Islam. Instead, what they're doing is they're basically showcasing the diversity that exists within Islam and how that diversity evolved in particular contexts. Okay. So as Diane Moore states, you know, having a basic knowledge of the world's religious traditions will deepen our understanding of multiculturalism and enhance our ability to embrace rather than fear our difference. So she has dedicated much work to promoting religious literacy as a means to combat othering, and then this would the Muslim literacy about Muslim diversity could have a very real effect in helping to alleviate the othering of Muslims in Canada and around the world. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ismaili community, but I don't want to speak too much on them because I want to be able to discuss the examples. But the Shia Ismaili community is a Shia community. They're the only Shia community that continues to have a living hereditary spiritual guide. Okay, so in Shia tradition, all Shias believe that when the Prophet Muhammad passed away, that the he left behind two things. He left behind the revelation, which was later recorded in the Quran. And then he also left behind his progeny, which would be who would help guide the Ummah to interpret the faith and across time and space, right? So Ismailis are the only Shia tradition today that continue to have this living authority that traces back his lineage to the Prophet Muhammad. And this becomes important because we not only see in the Ismaili example, we not only see these really high profile efforts to combat Islamophobia, you know, by the Ismaili institutions or the Aga Khan himself. We see it happening at grassroots levels as well. So we see individual Ismailis through whether they consider themselves ambassadors or whether they're a bit more organized in their efforts, doing creative things to help nuance the image of Islam and Muslims in Canada. So we're going to touch we're only going to touch on one example of that. We're going to talk more about some high profile examples, but this also coincides with the role of the Imam, right? So he's there again to interpret the revelation for the current day and age, and also to improve the lives of his followers and their respective communities. So alleviating Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment can be seen as a direct you know, as directly helping to better the lives of Muslims and Ismailis specifically in Canada and around the world. Because by doing so, you know, they're less likely to be discriminated against. They can feel safe and protected in their societies. And then they can have meaningful engagement with other Muslim communities and other non-Muslim communities in their spaces. Okay. Okay, so this Muslim literacy effort, in my research, I found that it's not only directed at non-Muslims, but it's also directed at Muslims as well. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about the latter, but if you want to ask questions about that, you're more than welcome to. But the reason why, as I argue in my thesis, the reason why this effort looks different than other Muslim efforts around the world is because of Ismaili identity and experience, okay? But again, I'm not going to touch on that too much, but if you want to ask questions about that, you're welcome to, or refer back to my thesis. Hopefully it will be accessible in 2021. I'm just waiting to defend at the moment. So some of the high profile examples that I'm going to talk about are the Aga Khan Museum, and this initiative that was done through the government of Ontario. It's called Shaping Pluralistic Dispositions in Education. And then there's an effort within that uses the Aga Khan Museum as a hub for this kind of curriculum linking and promoting dialogue. But while we're on this slide, there's this other example. Dr. Karim Galani, he did his PhD at the University of Alberta, and he's been really active in basically showcasing diversity in Muslim art and culture. So not only through musical expression, but also devotional expression. So he's been really influential in talking about this, whether it was in his academic life or whether it's in his artistic life. And one of the things that he did, so again, this is one of these grassroots level initiatives where Ismailis are using their privileged positions in society to try to alleviate or try to promote Muslim literacy, is he held a couple summer camps for people that live for students that live in Edmonton, which gave them which invited them to learn about Muslim diversity through music, art, and culture. Okay, so this is just one example where you can, you know, of how, you know, as I call them, the Ismaili intelligentsia, how they are using their privileged platforms to nuance the image of Islam and Muslims and also humanize them. Okay. Now, the Aga Khan Museum is probably the most high profile example in Canada. The Aga Khan Museum not only preserves Muslim art and history and showcases Muslim art and history, but it also showcases contemporary expressions of Muslim art and culture and devotional expression. And again, this institution, they have a mandate to try to promote understanding, you know, between Muslims and non-Muslims, but also between Muslims and Muslims, right? So they are always inviting different Muslim communities into and to take part in their various programming or to perform at various events, because they feel that it's important to have all of these diverse Muslim communities represented in the Canadian diaspora. Okay. This, I don't want to speak too much about it, but here you see the park itself, with the reflection pools. These are inspired by Islamic gardens of past. So again, showing that Muslims have always had this kind of rich culture. The Aga Khan Museum itself doesn't look very Islamic. If you were to just look at it, like, it looks quite modern. But on closer examination, you see Ismaili identity and other forms of Muslim identity expressed in its architectural design. Right now, this a lot of the projects, like the Aga Khan Museum, the Aga Khan Garden, which I won't speak about today, but that's at the botanical gardens at the University of Alberta, the Global Center for Pluralism, the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate building, many of the purpose-built Jamaat Khanas, which are where Ismailis go to congregate and practice their tariqa traditions. They represent this harmonization of Muslim and Canadian, right? They don't look like traditional Islamic, because to them those traditional Islamic buildings were situated in a particular context and influenced by a particular culture. And so through their buildings, they are expressing this, that you can be Muslim anywhere, right? Because being Muslim is, you can't take it out of its cultural surroundings. So you see this very modern expression of Muslim identity, basically being in quite harmony with with, in this case, the Canadian climate, right? They're choosing trees, fruit-bearing trees, which are important to the sacred myths of the Islamic tradition. That the garden, the primordial garden is filled with fruit-bearing trees, right? So they're using Canadian trees. They're, even with their the way that they did the water irrigation system at the Aga Khan Garden, they made sure that it could withstand Canadian climate, right? I won't go too much into it, because I have too much to say, and I know that I'm on time limit, and I haven't seen Kathy raise anything yet, so I know she'll interrupt me if I need to move forward. 5 minutes? Okay, great. I think I'll be done in 5 minutes. Thanks, Kathy. So, and again, in 2016, there was a collective agreement signed between the Ismaili Imamate and the government of Ontario. And lots of things were happening here, but one of the things I want to bring people's attention to is that this agreement wanted to make sure that pluralism was promoted in the classrooms, and that when teachers were teaching about Muslims and Islam, they were using the museum as a medium to bring in Muslim art, music, and culture into the classrooms. Okay, so all of these different educational boards around Ontario were invited to this conference, and they all discussed how we need to alleviate the othering of other communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, Muslim communities, all communities. And in particular, obviously, one of their important mandates of the time is to help alleviate Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment. And so they use the Aga Khan Museum as a way to do that. Oh, I am done. Okay, great. So basically, I've just tried to highlight some examples from my research on how the Ismaili community in Canada, whether through the Aga Khan, these high-profile efforts, or some grassroots efforts, and how they are collectively trying to alleviate Islamophobia through a very organized religious literacy effort. So not promoting their version of Islam by any means, but instead by promoting an understanding that Islam is inherently diverse, and it's always been that way. It was always known that it was going to be that way. And to, instead of glossing over these diverse Muslim histories, to showcase them and to see them as expressions of of time and space. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Next, I'd like to introduce, a little chance for applause there. Next, I'd like to introduce Megan Hollinger. She's also a doctoral student at the University of Ottawa. Megan's MA research examined legal responses to anti-Semitism in contemporary Canada, and her doctoral research moves beyond law to search for alternative solutions and strategies for combating anti-Semitism. Megan currently serves as the membership chair and program co-chair for the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, and she's a student caucus member of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project at the University of Ottawa. Megan is going to speak to us today about issues of interpretation, a case study of combating anti-Semitism in a legal context. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Kathy. Screen share. This research was taken from my master's thesis, so very recently from the summer. And instead of looking too much at my analysis, I did an analysis, discourse analysis of 4 hate crime cases from the last 12 years pertaining to anti-Semitic crimes, hate crimes. For time's sake, I'm going to look at one that kind of shows an example of the different things I want to talk about. But I won't go too much into detail about the analysis or legal method or discourse, which is more the focus of the thesis. I want to talk more about law as an approach or as a response to combating hate, particularly anti-Semitism, which is hatred against Jews in contemporary Canada. But I will use the case R versus Mar as my, I guess, to illustrate the examples that I want to talk about. So this is a 2010 case from the Ontario Court of Justice. Max Mar, the accused, was he was 83 years old at the time of the case. He was born and raised in Germany prior to the Second World War and actually fought for the German army during the Second World War and didn't come to Canada until the late 1950s. Unless he did and there's no record of it. Not until 2009, in his early 80s, did he decide to go around his home in Guelph, Ontario, spray painting different anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish slurs and rhetoric around public places such as parks and even in a Walmart. So that was interesting. Anyways, he was caught and eventually charged with a violation in the criminal code for section 319(2), which is in the hate propaganda section of the criminal code. And this is for willfully promoting hatred against an identifiable group, in this case, Jews. The court convicted him guilty and also added to his that his charge warranted some of the aggravating circumstances found in section 718(2) of the code, which is to I guess worsen the sentence or to add more to your charge if your crime was committed with a bias, motivation, or motivation of prejudice towards an identifiable group. So this is the sample of I'll leave it here for 2 seconds if people want to read it. Some of the evidence that was used in the judge's reasons for judgment, which is what I analyzed for this case. It's an interesting example. He talks about God, but it's not necessarily a religious motivation against Jews. I think I don't know why, but he became a practicing Buddhist after marrying his second wife in Canada. So that I'm not sure what the religious motivation was, but we do see, we know that the court stated his motivation was Nazi ideology because of his upbringing. And he also mentions Israel as well, presumably the state of Israel, as it's sometimes used as a term to talk about, Israelites as a people. But I'll just briefly go over some of the things I found in my analysis that'll illustrate how I want to talk about what happens when law is used to combat something like anti-Semitism or even hate. So the way that the court, sometimes courts construct through their methods, so the use of precedent or just through how they discuss and develop discourse about certain identities, definitions, etc. The courts talked about Jewish identity as well as anti-Semitism in their case, and in doing so constructed very limited views of what either looked like. And so, for example, in this case, so in my other 3 cases I did, this was slightly different, but in this case, the court classified Jews as a race. So there was a quote about Mar committing crimes against people of the Jewish race. It was a crime committed on race, national, or ethnic origin, which I thought was interesting because in the previous 2 cases I analyzed, which I won't talk about here, the courts limited their definitions to Jews just being religious, which they are not just religious. There are many non-religious aspects to Jewish identity, such as ethnicity, cultural aspects, national aspects, etc. So that's something that's interesting. Jews are not always religious, which is something kind of unique about their identity. Is you can be Jewish on the basis of your genetics as well, even your ethnic background, national origin, historical circumstances. So that was interesting that in this case, the judge broadened the definition of what it meant to be Jewish, which was positive compared to the other 2 cases, but it was also problematic, and race is also a controversial category in itself. And the problem is that, sure, in law, if you're going to try to define who Jews are and you broaden that, that's positive because perhaps you can increase the likelihood that somebody who is a victim of anti-Jewish hatred in a non-religious way may receive representation for their crime in law. It's also controversial, and it's also the way that Nazis classified, a major component of their anti-Semitism was racial hatred. And that's also presumably what was a big motivator for Max Mar. And so the court simultaneously reinforces that categorization while they're trying to respond to it. So the concern is that, and this will be for the next point too, is that if law has any relationship to us in the social sphere, and it constructs particular definitions and conceptualizations, is it limiting who Jews are, and is it limiting the kinds of hate that Jews can experience? So that was something that was kind of concern, and that's kind of a product of law's method and how it creates discourse. And so that was a problem. And so the next point was, in the example, we saw mentions of exterminating Israel as well, and exterminating the Jews, kind of all in one shot. And so there's a phenomenon called new anti-Semitism, which is anti-Jewish hatred. And this is, again, sometimes it's often a non-religious form, which is based off of hatred or prejudice towards Zionism as an ideology. So Jewish, I don't want to say nationalism, but the idea of Jews having a homeland in their ancestral homeland of the land of Israel. So that's Zionism. So people being against that movement or just against the state of Israel. It either forms as hatred against Jews, turns into hatred, or is disguised as hatred against Israel and Zionism, or hate or prejudice towards Zionism and Israel creates hatred towards Jews. And so the problem with this case is, as in the previous 2, was that the court never mentioned any instances of the new anti-Semitism, was never acknowledged. And this is probably for a few reasons. One, they may not have known how to catch it. They may not have known that was a part of anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Jewish hatred. They may not have known to look for it. There was no legal guidelines at the time in policy or law to including this kind of anti-Semitism, so it may not have been known. And it may also be a limit of the criminal code, which I'll get to in my endpoints. But that was problematic. But also, if his motivation was Nazi ideology, then the court definitely did contextualize their decision with that in mind. So that was positive. And one last thing that was very important for this discussion when the court applied law, or didn't apply it in this case, to this particular example, to Mar's case, was that, and this was possibly a problem with law enforcement, not necessarily the court system. Mar advocated in his statements for people to go kill Jews. He had specifically said kill all Jews at some point. He wrote that somewhere around, well, yeah. So that was concerning because, those words have been very true for many centuries, millennia, so those are very serious words. And at some point, the court did acknowledge that he was going around town urging others to kill Jews. But what was concerning was that there is actually a provision in the hate propaganda section for advocating genocide against an identifiable group, which was never, ever, it was never, I guess, the charge was never laid by law enforcement. The Crown never added it. It was never brought up at all. the section wasn't discussed, and that was concerning to me, because for whatever reason it wasn't. Those are serious words that have had historical meaning and truth time and time again. And so that could signal problems again, maybe with interpretation or with law enforcement. And so these are just some examples of when law was used as a response in this case. Now, that was used as a response because Max Mahr's anti-Semitic actions and ideas turned into past the threshold of, freedom of expression, freedom of whatever, to crime. And so he violated the criminal code. He was found to, and he was prosecuted accordingly. I'll just say some positives quickly because this wasn't all negative. The case actually, compared to some of the other ones I looked at, actually really contextualized its decision, the court, by talking about the broader social harm of Mahr's actions and words. So even though it missed some very important elements of the kind of hate that Mahr spread, such as new anti-Semitism, and it may have limited Jewish identity or reinforced a controversial category, it still understood that Nazi ideology has been harmful, so that we have to fight it and combat it, which maybe socially and more broadly gives the impression that this is a harmful motivation and a harmful ideology. So that was really positive. And yeah, just the strong references to victim impact and even just how it goes against Canadian values was really, really interesting too, how the judge mentioned that. But what I want to talk about a bit more is these main points, how they illustrate some of the limitations of using law to combat anti-Jewish hatred. Because it's often, in my experience, something that people do turn to is legislation, policy, politicians to pass laws, make acts, etc., to combat this kind of hate when, the hate's going up against Jews. And I wanted to know if law was doing anything, which was the basis for this project, because it is a common response, but hatred towards Jews continues to rise. They're continuously named the most hated group in Canada, the most hated religious group, which is also problematic because, again, the hate comes in non-religious forms as well. But again, so we have problems with laws, methodology, and discourse shaping things like who are Jews, what kind of hate do they experience? And if this is going to have an impact more broadly outside of law, if law has authority over us in the social sphere, that was of concern because it's going to shape what is legally unacceptable. And then maybe if it's something can't be prosecuted by law, maybe it's more socially acceptable, such as new anti-Semitism. So then it may normalize certain forms of hate to continue, or through its discourse reinforced categories such as race and social separation and division and essentialized identity. So that was concerning. There's also some institutional limitations and legislative limitations highlighted by my research. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just go over it quickly. All hate crime cases to go to trial must be approved by the Attorney General because it's incredibly hard to get a conviction under the hate propaganda provisions because you have to protect freedom of expression, freedom of belief and opinion in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So sometimes unless you can really prove that you can get someone convicted under those charges as opposed to a charge, of mischief or assault or whatever it might be, the Attorney General, you must prove that case and you must prove to them that this can go ahead under these charges. So many cases. So in 2019 or 2018 and 2019 combined, there was over 4,200 incidents of anti-Semitism. Only a few hundred were considered hate crimes by police. I think you could count on less than one hand the amount that went to court. So it's a very slow system and a system that's not quite efficient to keep up with the kind of hate that we have. And then that's problematic as well. And like I said, limitations with law enforcement. So maybe they don't understand the hate provisions. So they don't know to lay charges of advocating genocide. Maybe they don't know how to spot it. Maybe they don't know enough about forms of hate like anti-Semitism, even anti-Islamophobia, etc., where they would understand its manifestations, motivations to properly lay charges. And then they also have the limitations of, to get somebody convicted under those charges, they have to gather sufficient evidence as well, which also promotes limitations to prove that the motivation was bias or prejudice. And then legislative limitations, again, in the code and the charter. The code is also written in specific ways. And in order to convict someone under those charges, you have to prove that they meet the criteria set by those provisions. So if the problem with new anti-Semitism is it's often disguised as rhetoric against Israel or Zionism, not as against an individual or group, but a state or an ideology. And so even though it's an important part of contemporary anti-Semitism and it's often used to hide anti-Semitic hate and almost make it socially palatable, law may not be able, as it stands now, to catch that or prosecute it. And so law may not be able to touch because it's not going after an individual or group, right? So law may not be able to even combat the kinds of the forms that anti-Semitism takes. And it's not also aware of the many non-religious and religious ways Jews experience hate in Canada. And so there are limitations imposed by the current criminal code that are problematic. And again, freedom of expression, I'll end on that, that you also have to watch and protect, which makes hate speech very, very, very difficult to distinguish from protected speech and what can be considered criminal.
Thank you very much, Megan. Round of applause. There are some questions in the chat, and I'm reminding everybody that we will go to questions after all three presentations are finished. So if you have any questions brewing, please add them to the chat. There's a few there right now. And so now we have Maxwell Cannell, who is also a doctoral candidate, and he's at the Department of Religious Studies at McMaster University, working on a dissertation that compares approaches to violence in the works of Jacques Derrida, Mennonite pacifists, and feminist philosopher of religion, Grace Jansen. In addition to his dissertation work, Max has published several articles on philosophical, literary, and secular figures in Mennonite studies, and he's completing a book manuscript called Post-Secular History, Political Theology, and the Politics of Time, which is forthcoming with Palgrave Macmillan in 2021. Max is going to talk about ontologies of violence, deconstruction, pacifism, and displacement. Over to you, Max.
Thanks very much, Kathy, and thanks everyone for being here. So my talk is a little, it's dense and textual, so I've included in the chat a link to a text version if you want to follow along. I'm going to try to keep it within 20 minutes. And if not, I'll just stop and you can read the conclusion at the end. So Judith Butler begins her recent book, The Force of Nonviolence, by suggesting that before any debate about the ethical and political use of violence, there must be some agreement on what qualifies something as violent or nonviolent. Following this suggestion and some other questions she raises in her book, the question that I want to ask in this presentation and in my dissertation in progress is very basically, what is violence? So my interest is not in trying to theorize specific instances of violence, like in the case of war or murder, or engage in debates about just war and pacifism. Instead, my project attempts to understand what ontological and epistemological background work needs to be done before a shared concept of violence could be developed. So before we can ask whether violence is justified or not, and before we can ask whether something is violent or not, we first must ask, what is our measure for violence? So I begin with the assumption that the word violence doesn't really name something stable that one could either appeal to or categorically oppose. Calling something violent on the first face without clear explanation of what boundaries are being violated, I think says very little about what's being identified or condemned when the term is used. So my solution to this problem is to consider violence in relation to boundaries and the values that define them. So in each use of the term violence, the user points to certain boundaries that are violated, and these boundaries are defined by certain values. So one's concept of violence, in this sense, will reflect one's values, meaning that violence is a very useful diagnostic concept because its uses point back to the values held by its users. No one calls something violent without a normative foundation that they consider to be under threat. And we can tell a lot about what someone values by examining what they think is violent. So I'm going to return to this definition later in the presentation by using it as a way to read each of my sources. But here at the beginning, I observed that conspicuously, there's no shared definition of violence in our current social and political discourse. Instead, violence is a concept that's put to many different instrumental and political uses. And in The Force of Nonviolence, Butler sees something important in the diverse uses of the term. She writes, quote, "Some people call wounding acts of speech violence, whereas others claim that language, except in the case of explicit threats, cannot properly be called violent," end quote. Butler identifies a conflict between those who understand language to be violent and those who do not. And this is an important distinction for the sources I study in my dissertation. Butler addresses this problem by contrasting the figure of the blow with structural or systemic violence. She argues that, quote, any account of violence that cannot explain the strike, the blow, the act of sexual violence, including rape, or that fails to understand the way violence can work in the intimate dyad or face-to-face encounter, fails descriptively and analytically to clarify what violence is. So here, Butler sets out what I think are very basic conditions for understanding violence. She's writing in light of recent protests against police violence in the United States. She writes that when states or institutions use the term violence to delegitimize forms of political dissent that do not make recourse to physical violence, they seek to rename nonviolent practices as violent, conducting a political war, as it were, at the level of public semantics. So here Butler is critiquing those who use the term violence to demonize and vilify groups who commit acts of protest and civil disobedience, for example, anti-fascist or Black Lives Matter protesters. In short, Butler critiques those who use the term violence as a mere means to legitimize the use of lethal force by police and thereby delegitimize civil disobedience and nonviolent protest. So with this introduction to the political uses of violence before us, I want to field the main argument of my dissertation. It's titled Ontologies of Violence, Jacques Derrida, Mennonite Pacifist Epistemology, and Grace M. Janssen's Death and the Displacement of Beauty. In the project, I critically examined the ontological significance of violence in the early works of Derrida, in works of some Mennonite philosophical theologians, and in Grace Janssen's late work, Death and the Displacement of Beauty. So although Derrida, the Mennonites, and Janssen each use the term violence within very different academic disciplines and with very different priorities, each understand violence to refer to something that has an ontological and epistemological character. What makes my three sources unique is that, and what justifies bringing them together for comparison, is that they each consider violence to be an ontological problem. Violence in their work not only names physical violations of the body, but also describes ontological terms like being, or the use of persuasive force or coercion in the domains of thinking, knowing, and speaking. So in this way, each of my sources fall into the category provided by Butler of those who call wounding acts of speech violent. For the purposes of my summary, I'm going to focus on their most succinct formulations of the problem of violence. And I'll begin with Derrida, who says, predication is the first violence. In Derrida's long essay on Levinas, Violence and Metaphysics, he writes that language, specifically predication, is the original violence. So throughout the essay, Derrida does a complex thing. He entangles his voice with Levinas. He makes strong declarative statements like violence did not exist before the possibility of speech, or violence appears with articulation, and then predication is the first violence. So although Derrida often rephrases Levinas's ideas without making a clear distinction between his voice and Levinas's, I'm fairly certain that he thinks it's the case that language itself is violent. The notion that violence inheres in language is very complex for Derrida, but his underlying idea is that we can't be without violence. And this is something that his critics and interpreters will take up and use in different ways. So my dissertation examines the reception of Derrida by Mennonite pacifists who want to think and know peacefully, and by philosopher of religion Grace Janssen, who's critical of just exactly how Derrida thinks language is violent. So with this brief account of Derrida, I'm going to turn now to the Mennonite reception of Derrida. So in the Mennonite engagement with Anglican theological movement called Radical Orthodoxy, whose lead figure is John Milbank, the philosophical theologians Pete Bloom and Chris Huebner situate their work in relation to what they call an ontology of violence. So in this debate between Mennonites and Milbank that took place in the 2010s, The term ontology of violence most often referred to the idea that the ontological structure of the world is violently ordered. And for both Mennonites and Milbank, it's Derrida's work that most exemplifies what they're calling an ontology of violence. So they use, while using Derrida as a foil to talk about the problem of violence, Chris Huebner outlines what he calls a pacifist epistemology, which is a peaceful way of knowing. And Pete Blum challenges the possibility of an ontology of peace. He questions whether we can ever really be without violence. So I'm going to pass by Huebner for the moment and focus on Blum, because his response to Derrida and Milbank is, I think, exemplary of the problems I want to draw out. So in his work, John Milbank, the radical Orthodox Anglican theologian, he argues that Christian theology must oppose the notion of an original violence. And this is because for him, violence is, by definition, a secondary and willed intrusion on an established divine order. So Milbank categorically rejects the notion that Derrida and others express, that violence goes all the way down into the foundations and origins of language and being. Milbank expresses this idea in Theology and Social Theory, his book from the 90s, and then several Mennonite thinkers respond to this notion of ontological peace in a debate that I find some helpful framing of this debate in Travis Craker's essay, Educative Violence or Suffering Love. So in his essay, Travis Craker presents this dilemma that the Mennonites and Milbank are trying to work out. And it's a dilemma between an educative violence that justifies the use of force to ensure a peaceful ontological order, and by contrast, a suffering love that refuses to secure its ends by means of violence. So on one hand, we have John Milbank, who believes that violence is something that distorts the true meaning of things by ruining something's essence or diverting from its teleological end. Under this definition, violence, the world is peacefully ordered at its origin when things are in conformity with their essence and aligned with their right heading. And for Milbank, ontological violence arises when the essences of things and their proper orientation are disturbed or caused to deviate. This puts him at odds with the radical evil school, for whom evil has a positive status instead of being defined by the absence of the good. So Milbank not only thinks that evil and violence are defined in relation to an original order, but he also argues that it is defensible to coercively and forcibly ensure the preservation of this order by means of coercion. And so my dissertation shows just exactly how Milbank's defense of coercion could not be more at odds with the historical and contemporary rejection of force and coercion that defines much of the Mennonite identity, as well as its 16th century Anabaptist background. So for most, if not all Mennonite thinkers, peace cannot be achieved by means of force and coercion. In the discourse, this is often referred to as the myth of redemptive violence. So Craker's essay presents the other side of the dilemma. The Mennonite side is the one that rejects educative coercion and force to secure its essences and ends. Rather than believing that the world is originally and essentially ordered in ways that require forcible and coercive ordering, the epistemological model of suffering love that Craker suggests, it's defined by its critique of the desire to possess and control origins and ends. In this way, it's very much about time and history as well. So in general, for the authors who I study, a lot hinges on the question of whether faithful Christian beliefs and practices entail or allow the exercise of coercive power. So for Milbank, these questions are metaphysical. He says, when I am talking about peace, I'm also talking about signification and the metaphysics of participation. Milbank's ontological peace proceeds from a conservative Christian radical orthodoxy in which radicality is understood as a return to the root. Conservative in the sense that it seeks to conserve and preserve an ordered relationship between origins, essences, and ends. By contrast, I argue, Mennonite radicalism, which inherits the complex category of the radical Reformation, Mennonite radicalism understands the peace it seeks to be something that cannot be secured, but must remain precarious and is potentially impossible to achieve. This stark contrast is a really important part of the dialogue that occurred between the Mennonites and Milbank. And it's important in large part because it was not the central point of discussion. It's a kind of conspicuous absence that may be explained by the fact that metaphysical reflection has not been central to Mennonite theology. So Milbank's radical orthodoxy may at first appear to be quite a bit more philosophical and metaphysical than the Mennonite tradition, a tradition that's known for its lack of systematic theologies and its aversion to transcendental systems. But much of my research over the past several years has concerned Mennonite pacifist thinkers who do use philosophical resources and make metaphysical claims. One exemplary expression of what I've argued elsewhere is a recent philosophical turn in Mennonite theology. One exemplary expression of this turn is found in the work of Peter C. Blum, a theologian who intervenes between Milbank's original peace and Derrida's original violence. So rather than a pure nonviolence, as some Mennonites have advocated for, in which Derrida refuses in Violence and Metaphysics, Pete Blum calls for a kind of pacifism that says no to violence, even though this saying does not itself escape violence. So Blum does not retreat from violence or deny that there's violence in the world, even in language. Instead, he calls for an ontologically inflected pacifism that says no to violence without saying that there is no violence. Unlike Derrida, Milbank thinks that there is an original peace from which we diverge when we do violence. But Blum is a lot closer to Derrida here. He's more inclined to think that language is almost entirely violent. And Blum suggests that although there may be no way to be apart from violence, his readers need not consign themselves to the two bad options of kind of reactive counter-violence or the abdication of responsibility. So instead of understanding pacifism as either passivity or ignorance of violence, Blum wants to say there are ways to negate and resist violence without denying its presence in the world or intentionally using violence against violence. So this is a very abbreviated account of the tensions that my dissertation explores and extends. So most succinctly, Derrida suggests that because language is violent, we can't ever really achieve a pure nonviolence. And Milbank argues that ontological peace precedes the violent disordering of the world. And he argues that a radically orthodox Christian politics ought to use coercive force to set the world in order. And then Blum responds by arguing that although we can't do away with violence altogether, there are ways to resist it that don't consciously or explicitly use force and coercion. Stepping back for a moment, I observe that the term violence in these debates that I've just outlined is used in very abstract ways. It often refers to the use of force and power to coerce and persuade using language. But if we consider Butler's suggestion that any account of violence that cannot explain the strike, the blow, the act of sexual violence, fails descriptively and analytically to clarify what violence is, if we consider that, then we must see that there are real limits to this very interesting dialogue that occurred between Derrida, Milbank, and Blum. One thinker who has clearly attended to the limits of Derrida's identification of violence with language, and who has sympathies and connections with the Mennonites, is Grace M. Jansen, a feminist philosopher of religion who grew up in a Mennonite community, later became a Quaker, and taught at Manchester University until her death. So with just over 2.5 minutes left, I'm going to give a quick summary of Jansen's position because I think it connects with some of the previous presentations as well. So in her final trilogy, Death and the Displacement of Beauty, Jansen argues that the cultural habitus of the West is founded on this obsession with death, that both loves it and hates it. And this obsession with death violently displaces values of beauty and what she calls natality. Natality being the fact that we are born, and mortality, which is what displaces it, is defined by her as the fact that we will all at some point die. Jansen's work resonates with the Mennonite critique of violence, and she affirms some of it in her final book. But her main challenge to Derrida is that when language itself is defined as violent, the term violence no longer serves to distinguish the force of an argument and the force of a bomb. So she cites Derrida's claim in Violence and Metaphysics that violence appears with articulation. And she argues that in these formulations, the language of violence has lost its moorings. Here, the text version is a bit longer and has some more reflections on violence, but I want to make a final connection with Alicia Cummings, the first presentation that we heard. Alicia, you were saying that part of the efforts to combat religious illiteracy involve not replacing one identity with another, but instead showing diversity. And it struck me that this is the sort of thing that Jansen would really resonate with, because throughout her final trilogy, Grace Jansen is at pains to not simply replace one narrative with another and keep that relationship of dominance and submission, but to open onto a multiplicity of narratives. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Max. Well, we've had 3 very interesting presentations, and we have some questions, and so I'm going to use the chat questions to get us started. But if you'd like to indicate either in the, well, preferably in the chat, that you'd like to ask a question, or articulate your question in the chat, and then we'll take them in that order. So the first question is for Megan, and that's from Michael Gillingham. And Michael would like to know, or would like to have you define the new anti-Semitism for us.
Thank you, Michael, for that. Thank you, Michael, for that question. Yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, new anti-Semitism is anti-Jewish hatred directed at Jews. Now, there's kind of in a general sense, it works 2 ways. It's called new because it's typically seen. It doesn't necessarily just start, but it really blows up and really finding its form and validation after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. So post-war. I mean, the Zionism as an organized movement, it begins before that, but and the push for the State of Israel as a Jewish stater to have Jews living in the land in a more permanent political sense does start before that, but generally it's the second half of the 20th century to now, and so it either acts as a way to validate existing anti-Jewish hatred in a more socially palatable way. So if you disguise hatred against Jews as, well, no, it's just hatred towards the State of Israel, so the Jewish nation state, or Zionist ideology, which I think is a little tricky to separate from anti-Semitism because it's a specifically Jewish ideology, whereas Israel, it's much easier to, separate anti-Jewish hatred from just political criticism. And so it kind of works as a disguise and a way to make it a little bit more palatable, or it can even be used to validate prejudices against the Jews that already exist, and to keep that going. It can also be formed from just any kind of resentment or grievances against the State of Israel or Zionist ideology that then turn into hatred against Jews. I assume through the association of Jews with that state and that ideology. So that's basically what it is in a nutshell. It's typically seen, it can be appropriated by those with more traditional anti-Jewish prejudices, such as white supremacism, etc., on I would say the far right. But it's typically seen most prominently on the political left, the further left you go. And so that's something that usually I think surprises people that don't know that that anti-Semitism comes from all political bases, and this is this kind that's seen more on the further left side of the spectrum. Hope that helps.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Michael, do you have a follow-up on that, or?
No, actually, no, appreciate that. Appreciate Megan kind of clarifying that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, Pat has a question for Megan as well. And I know Pat had to leave, but I think it's a great question. And it kind of follows up on what you've just talked about. And Pat's asking if the legal system's discomfort with religion generally is blocking a fulsome consideration of cases of anti-Semitism like the one that you used as your example.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, well, thank you to Pat, who I know is not here. I'm taking that to mean so that their discomfort with issues of a religious nature and talking about religion is what's influencing their, I guess, not broadening their definition or not being able to conceptualize Jews in other ways. That's how I'm interpreting that. I don't know. My limited experience with cases of a religious freedom or religious rights in nature, oftentimes the conceptualizations of religion are also very limited and within what is maybe culturally comfortable. So sometimes very Christian understandings of religion influence how religion's constructed when dealing with religious issues of a Jewish nature, or there's, a case with a young Sikh boy who wanted to carry his kirpan, the ceremonial knife or dagger, to school, and when trying to talk about, or even indigenous spiritualities or non-religious issues, things are framed in comparison to a very traditional conceptualization of religion. And I think that sometimes that's perpetuated through how law, it's discourse, how it talks about issues of this nature. I think it comes more also just from a lack of understanding maybe of the diversity of Jewish identity, because I think a lot of people, sometimes Jews themselves, just say, oh, it's just a religion, but it really is so much more than that. And it's like I said, unique in that Jews in themselves are, there's the cultural aspects to it, but there's also ethnic aspects and even genetic aspects to Jewish identity as well that bind Jews, not just religion. And so I think maybe it's a lack of understanding possibly, or like I said, a lack of ability to, if the criminal code doesn't recognize particular forms of anti-Semitism, you can't prosecute it, well, then they just don't talk about it. And they focus on what will get them, or to be able to give the conviction that the person's guilty, because that's what you're trying to do, especially with a hate charge where it's hard to get that anyways. So
thank you very much, Megan. The next question comes from Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Oh, thanks first off to all three presenters. Great talks. I always have so many questions after these talks, but I'll limit myself to one, and it's for Alicia. So coming back to the idea of religious literacy as a potential way of combating Islamophobia in Canada. Now, kind of it's one that's prevalent in the literature on how do we deal with this reality of Islamophobia. But what I want to kind of talk about is how effective it may or may not actually be. So I always see religious literacy as being especially effective, like you talked about it, in the educational context. So amongst a younger generation who are in their kind of formative childhood and kind of teen years where they're learning and they're kind of assimilating information, they're slowly building a worldview. That's the kind of key time to get them, right? That's the key time to kind of really be like, hey, this is, like you say, it's to kind of promote pluralism, to kind of open the worldview to these different religions, ethnicities, and so forth. But I'm not convinced it's all that effective for kind of older generations, right? So, and this is kind of the, to what extent is it a solution? And the analogy I'll use is like climate change, because when I was growing up, everyone's like, oh, well, once everyone kind of knows about climate change, the solution will just appear, like we'll solve the problem. It's the most important thing is for people to know about it and to get educated. And what we're seeing now is that it's much more difficult than that, because there are structural factors at play. There's kind of these ingrained habits that we have that we've developed since we were kids. And so I was wondering, do you see religious literacy as a potential solution for groups who haven't necessarily been exposed to it at all or don't want to be exposed to it? Do you think there are other potential solutions at play, or do we just kind of wait it out and just kind of focus on younger generations and kind of just wait for the older folks who may not have as positive attitudes towards minorities to just kind of pass away and kind of just deal with it as younger generations?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question, because, aside from that, religious literacy in the classroom piece, you actually have to attend the Aga Khan Museum to, be able to experience Muslim diversity and culture in an experiential format. Same thing with the Aga Khan Garden, you have to go there. There are other efforts. So within the Ismaili community, there is an internal effort to make literate Ismailis about Muslim diversity and things like that. So it's starting at home, and part of the reason why they're doing this is not only so Ismaili practitioners are able to articulate themselves in a multicultural world and amongst different Muslim, religious and cultural traditions, but also because they know that a very effective way to alleviate, let's say, the cognitive dissonance that you experience when you meet the other, is by basically speaking to other people, right? So at the very ground, kind of micro level, it is there is an effort to train or to educate young Ismaili youth and adults, but again, they have to attend these things, to make them confident in their Muslim identity, and to basically try to change or just nuance the ideas or the image of Islam and Muslims amongst their peers and their colleagues, right? Now, is religious literacy actually going to work? We all learn about the Holocaust, right? We all learn about the Holocaust. We all learn about the atrocities committed against Jewish people throughout time and space, and yet we still have anti-Semitism. So, and we're taught this in the classrooms. We've been taught this for a long time, for decades we've been taught this, and there still exists anti-Semitism. So I don't know if I have, I guess I'm optimistic in that this is still a first step, because I mean, anti-Semitism for a long time, it seems that it did sort of decrease. Like I remember, I think that it never went away. I don't think it's ever really gone away, but I mean, and now it's starting to rise with populism, right? So I don't know, I can't say for certain that religious literacy is the solution, but I guess I'm optimistic in that it is one step in the right direction. Yeah.
Thank you, Alicia. We have a question now from Misha.
Yeah, I have a question for Alicia too. I was thinking more in terms of how religious literacy can help in reducing othering of in the aftermath of a trauma, like for a community having faced collective violence, and then right in the aftermath of the violence, so religious literacy is only for the non-Muslims to get acquainted with the culture, their culture, and then become more multicultural in that sense, and or is it also about how the community itself can be helped through that religious literacy and through their own culture to heal after violence that was perpetrated on them? Yeah.
So I hope I'm answering this question the way that you intended me to answer this question, but I wanted to give some examples of how the Aga Khan Museum itself has used very specific events to bring attention to Muslim suffering at the Aga Khan Museum. So one example is that when we had this refugee crisis of Syrian refugees, and a lot of countries didn't want to accept them, or they didn't want to accept them in great numbers, what the Aga Khan Museum did, and this was really much on the go, is they prepared an entire exhibition on Syrian civilization, art, and culture. And they put it together and they hosted it for for months. I can't remember exactly. I want to say for at least 6 months. And I know they extended the exhibition as well. And what they also did is they invited Syrians, Canadian Syrians, and new Syrian refugees. If you were Syrian, you were invited to come for free to, to basically, because as your identity is being tarnished through all these media expressions, this was a moment of, well, look at the pride. Like, you have pride in your identity, and they showcased art and culture from Syrian civilization. Now, this is not to say that the Aga Khan Museum only ever kind of speaks about or presents Islam in a positive light. They've also had exhibitions, talking about politics in Iran and politics in Saudi Arabia, right? And saying, one exhibition was, and forgive me, I don't remember the artist, but they had these beautiful white doves, kind of descending from the ceiling, and on those doves were the passports of young women, girls from different socioeconomic statuses, and basically bringing attention to the female guardianship in Saudi Arabia, and how women aren't allowed to leave the country unless they're accompanied by a male guardian. They have to have permission. So they do bring attention to these issues. Another example is, I think it was called like Rebel Mystic, Jester, and Poet. And in that, they were basically showing the diversity, the internal diversity that exists within Iranian society, that these Muslims, these Shia Muslims, are not complicit to the politics of their administration, and they're challenging them internally. They're challenging them through art. They're bringing attention to Western imperialism and how that has helped to shape the situation in Iran today. So they do bring in these controversial aspects, and so they do. So you can see that through promoting religious literacy in some aspects, that they do use it for healing, but they also do want to bring attention to some issues that continue to exist in the Muslim world. Yeah, because religious literacy isn't just about painting a positive image. It's also about talking about some of the ugliness that exists, right? But understanding that ugliness and that beauty in context. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I don't see any questions in the chat, but while we wait for people to think of questions, I have a question. And this is for Max. Max, I find this very interesting. I work in the field of family violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and so I'm often thinking about the conceptualization of violence, but I don't go to the ontological end of things. But I'm part of a religion and violence team, and we do a lot of work in terms of breaking the silence around the reality of domestic violence and family violence amongst all people of all religions, and that religious people are no more likely or less likely in Canada to be in situations of domestic or intimate partner violence. But we're very pragmatic, and one of the things that we do is that we talk about the vulnerabilities that religious people have, because violence is a part of, texts, practices, traditions in religion, but also nonviolence, peace, and justice are just as much a part of those traditions, and so we always point out that religion has vulnerabilities, but it also provides resources and strengths for religious people who want to work on anti-violence and to support those who have either acted violently or are victimized by violence. So I want to thank you, because I think this is really interesting work for religious folks, but also for non-religious folks, in trying to understand kind of the complexity of experiences of violence amongst religious people. And I don't know Grace Jansen's work really well, but I would like you to talk a little bit more, because in the written section, thank you very much for providing with that. I see this dialectic between natality and death that she's that she's writing about. And I love, her emphasis that we're not born alone, that, to be is to be in relationship. And it reminds me of I think it's Julia Kristeva's work. I'm not sure, some French feminist that, really asserts that it's not, what was it, Descartes? I think, therefore I am, this radical individualism. And then she argues, no, like to be is to be in relation, because one's being begins in the womb, in relationship. And so I don't know if she's pulling from that, but could you expand more on that? Because I think, obviously you didn't have the time. And to me, that's just fascinating about where you might go with that.
Yeah, I think so much hinges on how we imagine the complexity that you're talking about. So if we're initially having this debate, is religion violent? Is it not? And it's very simplistic. And then we want to make it more complex and say, well, look, and Jansen does this in her trilogy. She shows the deep violence of the ancient Greek and Roman thought, of Jewish and Christian genealogies, all these things, and then she shows resources for nonviolence within those traditions as well. Part of the brilliance of her work is she shows better options that existed at each kind of stage in historical development of these concepts. But what I really like about her work is that she might challenge some of this talk of complexity by saying, if we say, if we start talking about, religions are equally prone to violence as to nonviolence, then we risk setting up a scenario where we would then compete and look for a ton of evidence that religion is violent and look for a ton that it's not, and kind of have that back and forth. And it's that movement of displacement that she wants to get away from. I really think Jansen's helpful to challenge this idea that the real goal would be to say, religion is not violent and real religion is nonviolent. And then the opposite, say real religion is violent and anything else is just a secular resource or whatever. So that's kind of one way I'd go with it. And the other, you mentioned Kristeva, and it could have been Kristeva. It could also be Irigaray. And there's a line of influence directly from Irigaray through Grace Jansen, specifically on that issue. Yeah, and I think that's a huge part of both of their thought, that Jansen's got this great line that says, we may die alone, and this fear of dying alone is real, but it's impossible in a certain sense to be born alone. And so it's that kind of, she sees more resources in emphasizing our being born, our creativity, our ability to create things that are new. She sees more resources there than an obsession with death that just wants to die in glorious battle and that's it. So I think the way she imagines that repositioning is really cool. That she doesn't want to replace a big narrative about death with a big narrative about birth. She acknowledges the reality of both and wants to hold them in a complex tension that I think is instructive for discussions of religion and violence and of family violence too.
Thank you. Yeah. And, what that also makes me think of, though, is, emerging sort of neurobiological work, which is showing us that the mother's experience of violence, and perhaps even her grandmother's, and her mother's experience of violence are passed on, and that physiologically, children are impacted by that. And the importance of all of us working on this question of violence, because its transmission is intergenerational, not just through social learning, but also in our very biology and neurology. So really important. Yeah, sure.
I'm very glad you brought that up. A sort of silent partner, a fourth source in my dissertation that doesn't get enough credit is my wife Amy, who has worked in domestic violence shelters and now is a trauma therapist. And so this literature that you mentioned I'm very familiar with that, and I think that's a really exciting kind of way to think about violence as something that inheres in the body, right? There's Bessel van der Kolk has this book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is all about how those who've experienced different varieties of trauma and violence hold it in the body until, you know, in the positive event that it would be processed in therapy through whatever modality. I think that's an open end of my dissertation. I don't really get to that until the very end. And Jansen's very attentive to the body, but not quite in that way. I don't think she was up on, I don't think that was really in the air in 2004 and 5 when she was finishing up. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, Michael.
If there aren't other questions, I did want to ask Max really quick. You talked about Levinas really quickly. And I know that wasn't the direct focus of your conversation, but I've been doing some work with Levinas and Derrida, and I'm fascinated by the relationship between those two, which, you know, it's a fascinating relationship. What I was going to ask you, if you don't mind, and I know this wasn't directly what you talked about, but where would you situate Levinas? You seem to be, you know, putting Derrida on one pole and some of the other thinkers on another pole. Would you put Derrida on that scale, or I'm sorry, would you put Levinas on that scale, or is that just really not fair to Levinas to even put him into that conversation?
I think he could be situated on that scale in a certain sense. I kind of bend over backwards in my first chapter to try to show that when Derrida is commenting on Levinas, he's doing it in a very lyrical way. He's entangling his voice with Levinas. After a few readings of that essay, I think it can come clear that Derrida disagrees deeply with Levinas and says, look, Levinas thinks that in the face-to-face encounter, we can achieve a sort of peace, and in dialogue and in these things. And Derrida says, no, you know, language inevitably is going to hold some violence and bring some violence with it. And so I'd place Levinas a lot closer to some of the Mennonite peace theologians who really think that if we get our dialogue right, then we can remediate things like anti-Semitism or like Islamophobia. Like we can achieve a sort of peace. But some of the philosophical Mennonites who I work with say this notion that we can achieve or possess or hold peace, that's wrong-headed, and that ultimately defeats it at the end. So yeah, thanks for your question on Levinas. You know, that'd be a whole nother study, and I really appreciate how I kind of get Levinas through a straw with Derrida. But he's definitely on that spectrum of much closer to this notion that we can achieve peace even if language is flawed.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I appreciate you just thinking through that with me there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Okay, we have one more question. The last question goes to Chris Miller.
Hi, I have a question for Alicia. Curious, with all of the sort of attempts at religious literacy and reaching out to other communities, does it ever sort of backfire? Are there any incidents of that where, you know, becoming more aware of the other or becoming skeptical of, oh, how the other is like attempting to, I don't know, pull the wool over people's eyes or something? Does it ever contribute to a kind of negative reaction?
That's a really great question. So one thing that I do talk about in my thesis is how Ismaili identity and experience shape their religiousy efforts to not only promote Muslim literacy amongst non-Muslims, but Muslims themselves. And the reason being is that there is a direct attempt to engage other members of the Ummah, so other members of the Muslim community, the diverse Muslim community in Canada, to take part in many of their, public engagement efforts. When the Aga Khan Museum was being built, there was, a few voices that came up saying, we don't need a Muslim art and culture museum. We need the end to policing Muslim communities. We need an end to the discrimination against Muslim communities, right? Like this. And so because this religious literacy effort is coming from a minority Muslim tradition who has been persecuted by other Muslims throughout time and space, it does come off as, who are you to do to do this work. And that's why it's so important for the Ismaili community who's doing this work to engage all those voices, to engage those communities, so that it's not something that just the Ismailis are doing. They really do want it to be part, like this Ummah effort, the Canadian, amongst Canadian Muslims, to do this sort of work. Does that answer your question, Chris? It's a great question, but.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. But if I can just briefly follow up, when you talk about like those kind of small dissenting voices about this is not what we need, was that Ismaili Muslims saying this is not what we need, or that was non-Ismaili Muslims saying this is what?
Yeah, that's and again, what I talk about in my thesis is something called intra-ummah dissonance, which is basically the discomfort that Muslims may have when confronted with another Muslim ummah, another Muslim another Muslim that's different from themselves, right? So just like we have maybe truth claims in Judaism and Christianity and wherever, you also have that within Islam. And so there is a direct attempt by certain Muslim extremists to basically gloss over that diversity and try to make Islam a monolith, basically saying that Islam needs to be this way. And so that's why it becomes ever more important that the Ismaili community is not replacing one homogenous narrative with another, right? That's why it's important that they showcase Muslim diversity in all of its beauty and in all of its ugliness, because through that, they're never saying that you're not a Muslim because you're doing this. And because that's what other Muslims are doing around the world. These exclusivist, they have exclusivist ideologies that basically promote a very monolithic understanding, a very exclusive understanding of what makes a Muslim. And that sanctions the violence against Muslim minorities around the world, right? So like ISIS, for example, they don't just kill non-Muslims, they target Muslims. They target Muslims that don't look like them. The Kenyan mall shooting targeted other Muslims that weren't like them. So there were Muslims targeting other Muslims. The Pakistani bus attack, they went onto the bus and killed a bunch of Ismailis because they did not, basically look and behave and believe the same way that those Muslims did. So there are tensions within the Ummah, and so this is like another part of my dissertation that I speak about, and that there needs to be healing within the Ummah. There needs to be tolerance within the Ummah if there's an expectation that there's going to be tolerance towards Muslims, right? There has to be internal healing before that can happen. Yeah.
Great. Well, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Well, thanks again, everyone. This was a great webinar, another great webinar. Just wanted to mention our last fall webinar of this term. That's going to be at the end of November, so the 26th of November. It's titled Religion and Otherness, the Concept of the Other and Working Towards Decolonization. We're going to have presentations, similar format as today's, so with Diana, Clara, and Sandra. And that'll be chaired by Michelle. So thank you, Michelle, for doing that. So as usual, to attend it live, it's for CSSR members, and then we'll record it and we'll post it on YouTube for everyone to view afterwards. And you register for the webinar the same way as you did for this one or the last one on that Google form, that same Google form. So if you haven't done it already, I know that some of you have already registered for the third webinar, so thanks for that. But if you haven't done it, go visit it. Go visit the Google form and quickly check the third webinar. And then I'll send you the Zoom link as usual, and I hope to see you there. So thanks again, everyone. Hope you guys have a good evening, soon to be weekend. Not quite to the end of term yet, but we're definitely in the second half. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'll hopefully see you at the end of November. Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye, everyone.